In today's world of instant gratification, I'm sure you're dying to know what stock we're going to talk about today. Well, you can find out in about 30 seconds, but try and guess which company based on these three clues. So, over 90% of their revenues come from data center hardware. They're currently displacing a legacy hardware dinosaur, and they've performed exceptionally well since their IPO a decade ago. The company we're going to talk about today is Arista Networks. The ticker is ANET. Here you can see their returns charted against the NASDAQ. So since their IPO, they've returned 2,108% versus NASDAQ at 287%. So it's very important to use a benchmark whenever you're looking at how well a stock has performed over time. Now, to learn about what Arista does, I wanted to point you to this picture. So my first job when I started uni, I worked through uni, and my first real job was at a software testing company. And they just threw me into this room and said, now you're the IT admin. And the room looks something like the picture on the left. And after I got done with it, it looked like the picture on the right. So the hardware that you see there, these are Ethernet switches. So simply put, an Ethernet switch or a hub is a hardware device that's used to connect computers. And I really like this diagram. In its simplicity, you can see there at the software testing lab I worked at, we did a lot of work testing printers, and our printers actually plugged right into that Ethernet switch. We were always switching cables around and such. But this is basically connectivity hardware. There's nothing really new about it, though it's constantly going through technological advancements. Now, Arista, this was founded in 2004 by former Cisco engineers. That's important to note for later on. They emerged as a rival to Cisco in the multi-billion-dollar market for Ethernet switches used in data centers. That's what we're going to be talking about today, Ethernet switches, particularly those used in data centers. Now, an investor relations team is important because they help convey the value proposition of a company to investors. Arista doesn't seem to have a very good IR team. This slide is absolutely useless. I found it on their general investor deck along with a lot of other slides that weren't overly valuable until I came across this very useful slide. This shows their market leadership in, again, we're talking Ethernet switches, but look, they're providing a certain category, 100G, 200G, 400G. Those are referring to gigs in bandwidth. So you see here Arista has a 42% market share in this niche. Look at Cisco at 21%. And then I think ROM, that might be rest of market. Now, Cisco does lead in the entire Ethernet switch market, but in this particular niche, Arista leads. That's going to be important to note later on. Notice how we've started talking about bandwidth. Well, look here. First, look at the chart on the right. So there's a 100-fold price decrease for Ethernet switches from 2008 to 2022. This is quite surprising when you consider that Arista has gross margins over 60%. That's very high for a hardware company. So the chart on the left is interesting because it shows the need for Ethernet switches to have increasing bandwidth over time. When you think about data and bandwidth, just think of a pipe and water. So the bigger the pipe, the bigger the bandwidth, and the same holds true for when you're transporting data. And I think this chart shows the progression of speeds over time. This is intuitive, right? So over time, we expect these switches to process more and more data, the pipes to grow bigger, and you can see just gigabits per second, the number going up over time. So look, remember we talked about 1, 2, and 4. Look at those. They're a channel right in the middle there, but look at 800 Gbps coming in 2028. So that's rather intuitive to understand the progression of this technology. And when we look at this great chart from Arista, which shows how they're absolutely destroying Cisco. So when I did my MBA, we did a lot of what are called Harvard Business School case studies. This would make a perfect one. I bet there is a case study on this probably being worked on or maybe already out. What you want to understand here are two stories. One, How does Cisco go from a 78% share in dollars down to 37% since 2012? That's 12 years they've been absolutely destroyed. And how did Arista defeat them? So Arista's stealing a lot of their market share. So that's an entirely different discussion. What we're concerned about today is to look at the leaders in Ethernet switches. This is at a very broad level you see here. Huawei. So there we see the Chinese making an entrance. HP Enterprise, ODM Direct. So we're going to touch on that and Arista. Now, IDC looks at Ethernet switches in such detail. I was quite blown away. They have the worldwide quarterly Ethernet switch tracker. There's a team of 6 people that runs this thing, and you see they're covering all kinds of things from companies and vendors to the speeds we talked about, to look on the lower right there, place in network, data center and non-data center. Oh, interesting. So at a very broad level, all Ethernet switches, that market's $44 billion in 2023. Well, if we look at Arista Networks' 2023 revenues of $5 billion in product and $0.8 billion in services, we divide that $5 billion in product by the $44 billion in total Ethernet switch market. Now, they've captured about 11%. Now, when we start digging into more details, particularly around data center Ethernet switching, so this firm, the Next Platform, we used their articles extensively for this video. They do a great job, and you can read some of the factoids here. So data center Ethernet switching rose 13% in 2023, so not a ton. But it made up 41.5% of the total Ethernet switching market. Well, great. We can then look at what percentage of that Arista has managed to capture. And look at this third bullet point. Revenues for 200 to 400 GBE switches rose nearly 69% in 2023. That's very notable, and later you're going to see why. 100 GBE switches made up 46% of the data center segment's revenues, rose just 6.4%. That's because companies are upgrading those pipes, right? Moving to the 2 and 400. So you would expect to see more of that over time. And here they mention how direct sales are growing, and that's just another competitor that Arista has to deal with. Now, this next slide looks at Cisco's Ethernet revenues, which increased 22% in 2023. That's pretty good. But look at this. Non-data center revenues made up nearly 70% of Cisco's total Ethernet switch revenues. Their DC revenues, so data center revenues, rose 9.7% for the year, so a lot less. They're not capturing as much market share in data center switches, and you see Cisco's total Ethernet switch share stood at 43% for 2023, as we saw before. But look at this last factoid. This is probably one of the most important pieces of information, I think, in this presentation. Arista Networks Ethernet switch revenues, 91% are in the data center segment. There we go. And they increased 35% in 2023, giving the company 11.1% market share for all Ethernet switches. But now that we know nearly all of their switch revenues are related to data center, we can capture, or we can figure out how much data center market share they've captured. It turns out to be around 27%. So this slide here shows the success they've been having over time. You see the yellow bars revenue, the black bars their profits. You see that little dip, what is that, in 2018 or so? That's when Arista paid $400 million to Cisco to resolve some lawsuits that Cisco had filed against Arista, claiming they copied its intellectual property. That's not uncommon for when an employee of a company goes and starts their own company selling something similar. It's not surprising you'd see that sort of lawsuit. But here's what's really interesting about Arista. So whenever we evaluate companies, we're concerned about customers that account for more than 10% of revenue. So that's what we call customer concentration risk. So we look here on the lower left, you see the percentage of revenues in 2021, 2022, and 2023 coming from Microsoft and Meta. So combined, those two companies accounted for 39% of Arista's revenues in 2023. Well, cool. What we can then do is start working out what those numbers look like. Once we know those numbers, then we can subtract them from Arista's revenue. So let's take a look at the charts on the right. The one on the top shows Arista's revenues as they are and the growth each year. The chart below that is X, Microsoft, and Meta, and this is very interesting. So once we trim those two largest clients off, we don't see a lot of growth leading into 2022. But look at that spike, 41% growth in 2023. That shows us that outside of these large clients they have, their other clients are seeing a strong demand for data center switches. And look here at this little blurb from a Next Platform article. It says, in 2022, after skipping the 200 GB a second generation of Ethernet switching, Meta went all in with 400 GB and increased its spending with Arista by what they estimate was a factor of 23.5 times to $1.12 billion. That's rather interesting. So what do we know about Arista so far? Well, they're selling hardware required for data center buildouts. They're nearly a pure play on data center hardware. A certain amount of their growth is coming from destroying a formidable competitor in the form of Cisco. We've covered Cisco before. We did in a video, and it's not an overly compelling firm. They lost their way at some point. Probably a very good case study to be had there. And at some point for Arista, I think the low-hanging fruit's going to go away when it comes to stealing things from Cisco quite easily. But upgrading switches is an ongoing need across all applications of Ethernet switches, not just data center. So what Arista needs to do is stay ahead when it comes to those higher bandwidths we noted on that previous slide. I think this is going to need some more research. Now, one thing to note here is Arista's relationship with NVIDIA. Here you can see an article that came out. Arista delivers holistic AI solutions in collaboration with NVIDIA. Well, everybody these days seems to be collaborating with NVIDIA, and they talk about, you see this sentence here, how aligning compute and network domains is a single managed AI entity. I don't know what a single AI entity means, but I think this other similar statement here, coordination between AI networking and AI compute infrastructure. Well, that makes sense, right? And that's where NVIDIA, who produces the compute, would want to get involved. And NVIDIA is already dabbling there. And again, from the Next Platform, very interesting here, they say, our model shows, I'm curious how they modeled this, of NVIDIA's data center revenues. They're applying some sort of formula to figure out what Infiniband sales are. So this came up in our last video on data center stocks, and Infiniband is hardware produced by NVIDIA. We're going to look at what it is in a second, but look at this growth. So this was the last 12 months ending in January. So this was essentially last year. Infiniband rose by 315%. And they talk about here, they think Arista and Cisco took bites out of NVIDIA's Ethernet business. Well, that's something we want to dig into. Since we're shareholders of NVIDIA, we certainly want to understand what's going on there. And they make an interesting comment here, which is spot on. Big companies don't like to concentrate their supply chain risk. Well, if that's the case, and Meta and Microsoft are the largest clients of Arista, you would think they're also purchasing similar hardware from somewhere else right now. So are there any other networking companies seeing Meta and Microsoft as large clients? Well, we don't know. But when it comes to what Infiniband is, I liked this slide, which shows how it relates to Ethernet switches that we've been talking about. So look at the common words here, network interconnection, okay, and both are used, both Ethernet and Infiniband are used. But Infiniband is a specialized technology focused on high bandwidth, low latency, and high reliability. It says it's found widespread adoption in the field of high-performance computing clusters and is the preferred network interconnect for GPU server environments. Well, who makes the GPUs? Well, that tells you something. Look at this. Infiniband from NVIDIA is found in 62% of the top 100 supercomputers. So you can see there are lots of rabbit holes to go down here, and I think that even though I've been talking for quite a while, I've barely scratched the surface, and there are certainly some to-dos coming out of this presentation. One, we want to explore how Arista competes with Broadcom and NVIDIA in particular. We want to know how NVIDIA's Infiniband product threatens Arista. What other Ethernet offerings does NVIDIA dabble in? This goes to their acquisition of Mellanox and better understanding where that fits in. We want to look at valuation for Arista. That's very important. I quickly calculated their simple valuation ratio. That's a form of price to sales. It comes in at around 14. So it's rather rich, but not something we couldn't take a strike at if we wanted to. And I think examining the dynamics of coming products is important. And just getting back to valuation for a second, I think price to sales isn't fair because this is a profitable company. So we're going to want to use probably price to earnings. We're going to want to compare that to some similar industry comparisons. So, for example, how do they compare against Cisco, right? Certainly Cisco isn't growing as fast as they are. But at any rate, if you sign up for our free newsletter, we're going to put a link in the comments section. So just click that link, sign up, give us your email. I will never use it for anything nefarious, and we'll let you know when this premium article comes out and help you become a better investor. So I'm going to go ahead and leave you with another piece that you'll find interesting. This touches on over 30 data center stocks that we looked at in our previous video. Make sure to subscribe to our channel and support our work. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this today.